Okay, so now that we have a firm understanding of the events that lead to the American War of Independence, let's actually get down to brass tacks and let's talk about this American War of Independence. We're going to approach this lecture in two parts. The first part, we're going to focus on kind of the setup of the American War of Independence, talk about some of the big themes going on. The second part will deal with some of the more important battles and some of the more important campaigns, and ultimately the end of the war. So what we need to do first is, since this is a war and we need to understand both warring sides in this war, we need to talk about the strengths and the weaknesses for both the Americans and the British. And we're going to take the British first. As you can see on the slide here, the British have a lot of strengths on their side in this conflict. So let's talk about a few of them. Number one is that they have history on their side. And what I mean by this is that the British, by the time of this War of Independence, have had a long history of victories over very strong European powers. They have defeated France, they have defeated Spain, and so this long history of victories over these major powers has provided the British military with valuable experience, but it has also provided the British military with very high morale. And what that means is that the Army and the Navy for the British, they feel good about their chances in this war. They have history on their side. They've done this before, and they've defeated powers that are much more stronger than the American colonials. Number two strength here for the British is, of course, the British Army. By the time of this revolution for the Americans, the British Army was the best army in the world. I mean, just look at this slide. They just look beautiful. Gosh, look at them all lined up perfectly. They are the best equipped, the best disciplined, they are the best paid, they are the best fed, they are the best the world has seen up to this point in world history. And so this ends up being obviously a major strength for the British. The third, and perhaps one of the biggest strengths that the British have in this conflict, was funding of the war effort. The British Parliament will have a much easier time raising the necessary money needed to wage this war for the British, much easier time of doing this than especially the colonials will. And this was largely the result of things we've talked about already in this course. Not only do they have a very efficient form of taxation in Great Britain, but they also have access to credit. And so when they're going to wage this war, they're going to have access to a lot more money than the colonials, than the Americans will have. And so this is going to end up being a major strength for the British. The fourth kind of segues from this superior funding that the British have. In this conflict, the British are going to be able to supplement their armies by hiring soldiers that are not British. The hiring of soldiers, these are known as mercenaries. In the American War of Independence, the British hired mercenaries that we know as Hessians. They were called Hessians, and here's a picture of one of them. They had more than just one. That would be amazing with just this one badass mercenary. They had thousands of these guys. They were Hessian. They were called Hessians because they came from Germany, an area of Germany known as Hessia. And these were the mercenaries that the British used in this war. And they were able to do this because of their superior ability to raise money for the war effort. And these mercenaries were a strength for the British because it allowed them to swell the ranks of the British military. So this is a big strength for the British. The fifth is Indian allies. In this conflict, in spite of the promises made by the Americans, most Indian tribes in North America decided to side and ally themselves with the British. A lot of scholarship has been written as to why this was the case. From what I've read of it, it essentially comes down to many of the Native Americans preferred the British over the Americans simply out of the fear that they might have seen what was coming with the Americans, that kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend type things. But Indian allies for the British are a big strength because it allows the British to have scouts that know the terrain, they know the territory, they know the best supply routes. And so these Indian alliances will end up being a big strength for the British. And the last strength I want to discuss here for the British is the Royal Navy. By the time of this conflict, just like the Royal Army, the Royal Navy is the best in the world. They have defeated the French Navy, they've defeated the Spanish Navy, they're the best. And the Royal Navy, being the best in the world, they had a navy, we did not have a navy. The Navy allowed the British to move men and material, war materials, anywhere on the battlefield, anywhere in North America, very quickly and efficiently. And this ends up being a major strength for the British. In addition to being able to move men and material quickly, the Royal Navy also ended up being a strength because they will end up being able to blockade the entire American coastline and cut off all supplies, or virtually all supplies that will be attempted to be funneled in to the colonies during this conflict. So as you can see here, there are a lot of strengths for the British, a lot of strengths. However, there were a lot of weaknesses for the British, and this is where I want to turn to now. There are some very important weaknesses that you should understand, especially in understanding how the British ultimately lost this war. The first weakness they had is, even though they had history on their side, and even though they had high morale, this can sometimes be a weakness, because it means that the British are going to be cocky. They're very cocky in this war. Numerous times the British commanders in North America will dramatically underestimate the American military capabilities, and even worse, they will almost always underestimate the abilities of General George Washington. And so this history on their side, while being a strength, is also a weakness, because it will mean that they are very cocky, and they will underestimate the Americans. Numerous times this will happen, and usually it will result in a dramatic defeat here for the British. The second weakness is distance. The British Army and the British Navy is controlled by the British Parliament and the King, which is over 3,000 miles away from the battlefront, all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. So any type of change in strategy, any type of orders that are going to be sent to the British armies in North America is going to have to travel over 3,000 miles, and in most cases it's going to take about 3 months to get there. What this means then is that the British Army is not going to be able to react to conditions fast enough. And so this distance ends up being a big weakness here for the British. The third weakness concerns those mercenaries. While mercenaries is a strength for the British, it's also a weakness. And the reason for that is that mercenaries fight for only one reason. They fight purely for money. They do not fight for love of country. They do not fight for God and king and all that good stuff. They're not fighting to defend their homes or anything like that. They're fighting simply for money. And if at any moment in this war or at any moment during a battle, it gets really hard, it gets really tough, oftentimes what we saw is that many of these mercenaries would just say, it ain't worth it. And so the use of these mercenaries at many points during the war will end up being a weakness for the British. Now the last two weaknesses are very, very important. When the war first began, the British were able to focus all their attention on the Americans. And use the full might of their military against the American military. But we know with hindsight that eventually the French will come into this conflict on the side of the Americans. And when that happens, the British attention in this war will become divided. They will not be able to use their full military against the Americans, because now they are also going to be fighting the French. And they have to maintain the world empire. So once the French get involved, this really ends up distracting the British. And this is a major weakness. It's a great strength for us, but it's a major weakness in the end for the British. And the worst, or the most important weakness is that as this war dragged on, because it lasted a very long time, as the war went from 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 years, 5 years, the British people back home became very divided. The English, over time in this war, began to ask, how long is this war going to take? How much is it going to cost? And ultimately what we're going to see in part 2 of this lecture is that they will eventually just say the war is not worth it. Okay, so this divided attention, this division at home, the weakness of mercenaries, the weakness of distance, and the weakness of the fact that they're just very cocky. These are some major weaknesses for the British, and these are actually the weaknesses that will end up undoing the British. Okay, now I want to turn and talk about the Americans. The Americans, you can see on the screen here, we don't have a lot of strengths. We don't really have, and we have a lot of weaknesses. Let me talk about two strengths here. for the Americans. The first is home field advantage. If we have any sports fans out there, you know what home field advantage means. It means you're fighting this war on your home turf. The Americans are going to be fighting in their own backyards. They're going to be fighting to defend their homes, to defend their families. When you are faced with a war like this, in which that is what you are fighting for, to defend everything you have, this tends to make people sacrifice more in a conflict and put up with more hardship and fight longer and harder. And this is exactly what happens here in this conflict. The home field advantage, while giving us a lot of strengths in terms of knowing the terrain and knowing the territory, it also means that we're going to put up with more in this conflict. We're going to fight harder. We're going to fight longer, because if we lose everything. The other strength we have in this conflict is time. Here's the beauty of this conflict for the Americans. We don't even have to win this war. We do not have to defeat the British in every single battle. We don't have to destroy every single British army in North America. All we have to do in this conflict is make this conflict long, stretch this conflict out, raise the casualties the British will suffer, raise the amount of money the British will have to pump into this war effort, and if the war lasts long enough, there's a really good chance the British may just end up quitting it. So it's kind of interesting when you think about it, is that we don't even have to win this war. We just have to make it costly. We have to make it long. And so these are strengths that the Americans have. But guys, other than that, that's all we got. We have a lot of weaknesses, though. We have a very small army in this conflict. It means that we're going to have to rely mostly on militias. Militias are poorly trained. They're notoriously unreliable. Our army was just never that big. This was a huge weakness. It meant that whenever we go toe-to-toe with the British army, we were going to be up against it. Another weakness is that we don't really have a navy. We have no formal navy. The only type of navy forces we had is that we ended up hiring pirates to just attack British commerce ships. Now, I mean, that's all fine and dandy, but we just don't really have anything to compete against the British Navy, and so this is a major weakness for the Americans. And the third weakness is that our national government during the American War of Independence, our national government was the Second Continental Congress. Well, this Congress and this government was very weak. It did not have the power and the ability to effectively wage this war, and this ended up being a major weakness for the Americans. So hopefully you're getting a sense that on paper, it looks like the British should kick our butts. Now we know with hindsight, though, that this doesn't happen. And as we go through part 2 of this lecture, I'll show you how these weaknesses for the British played out and how the strengths for the Americans ended up winning this conflict. Now, one last thing concerning the very weak national government. Although this national government was very weak, meaning it didn't have a lot of power, even though it didn't have a lot of power, our national government during this conflict worked its butt off. And that's where I want to turn to for the last part of this lecture. I want to talk about the Second Continental Congress during the American War of Independence, and I want to talk about some of the things that the Second Continental Congress did during the war that shows you that it was acting as a national government. Because it was our national government during the war. And even though it was weak, it did work its butt off. And it did a lot of things that show you it was a national government during the war. Okay, so what were some of the things then that the Continental Congress was doing to illustrate that they were serving as a national government? Well, they were doing a few things. Number one, and we've already talked about this, they raised the Continental Army. That is something that a national government does. They also sold government bonds in an attempt to raise money for the army. Again, raising money to maintain a national army is something that a national government does. Now, if you don't know what a bond is, a government bond is essentially an IOU in which the Second Continental Congress would give an individual a bond in exchange for money, in which, you know, after a certain amount of time, that individual that has the bond can go and cash that bond in and get all their money back plus interest. And this is the way the Second Continental Congress raised money for the war effort. Now, I want you to remember right here that this is going to end up being a big problem when the war is over, because you can sell all the government bonds you want, but if you can't end up paying them back, you're going to have a problem, and that's going to be a big problem when the war is over. But raising an army and raising money for the army is something that the Second Continental Congress was doing. It's something that shows you it was acting as a national government. In addition, the Second Continental Congress recruited during this war foreign military advisors to come over to the colonies and help fight, but also to help train the Continental Army and the colonial militias. Now I want to talk about two of them that are kind of worth knowing. The first was a man, and here's his full name. His full name was Friedrich Wilhelm Ludolf Gerhard Augustin von Steuben. We'll just call him von Steuben. He was a German military officer that came over here, recruited by the Second Continental Congress. He came over here during the war. He was very knowledgeable on how to train militaries effectively, turn them into effective fighting forces. He was also a colorful figure. He cursed a lot. He didn't speak English, so he always needed a translator. But von Steuben, who was recruited by the Continental Congress, will play a pivotal role here in this war, and we'll talk more about it when we get there. But the Continental Army being turned into a professional army is a direct product of von Steuben's training and his drilling. So von Steuben is one of these foreign military advisors that the Second Continental Congress recruited. The other, and probably the most famous, was an individual from France who came over here at the age of 20. At the age of 20, he was already a major general in the French army. He came over here very early in the war, and his name was the Marquis de Lafayette. He was French nobility, and he came here to the United States because he truly believed in what the Americans were fighting for. He believed that the American War of Independence was the first shot fired in a global revolution that would eventually rid the world of monarchy. So he's what we call a true believer. And his contribution to this war effort was so important that when the war was over, he was given honorary U.S. citizenship. He's only one of two people that this was ever bestowed upon. There's a famous story of when he did report, or when he showed up here in the colonies and he was assigned to the Continental Army as an advisor. When he reported to George Washington, he was famous as walking into Washington's tent, saluting General Washington and saying, "General Washington, I am here." Now I'll tell you that little side story because during World War I, when the Americans finally joined the Allies in World War I, the general for the United States, a man by the name of General Pershing, when he reported to the French High Command in France in 1917, he famously walked in, saluted the French, and he was famous as saying, "Lafayette, we are here." Kind of as showing he's a student of history and that we are returning the favor. But what you have here, you have the Second Continental Congress recruiting foreign military advisors. This is something that a national government does, and it was something that the Second Continental Congress was doing. In this case, von Steuben and the Marquis de Lafayette. Another example of the Second Continental Congress acting as a national government is that during the war, it'll be the Second Continental Congress that will form the alliance with France. Now, we'll explain how that happens in part 2 of this lecture, but just know that this is an example of how the Congress was acting as a national government. Forming alliances with other countries is something that national governments do, and this is something that the Congress will be doing during the war. Now, I briefly want to talk about this alliance for a few seconds. You may ask yourself, why would France be interested in helping the Americans in their war of independence against the British? Well, and the reason you may ask that is that we are fighting against monarchy. We are fighting to rid the colonies of monarchy. Well, France was a monarchy, so you may question, why would France even be interested in this? And that's a good question, because we tried to get France to join us at the very beginning of this conflict, but they weren't that interested at the beginning of this conflict. So why would they ultimately want to join us? Well, it's the British we're fighting. They hate the British. The British has taken everything from them in North America, as we saw with the results of the French and Indian War, and so for the French, this was payback time. Now, the reason they don't jump right into bed with us, or right at the beginning of this war, is that they did not believe that we could win this war. And they were a little hesitant because they did not really believe in the Americans' cause. Because again, France is a monarchy, we are fighting to rid monarchy. So it's going to take time to develop this alliance with France. They're going to need to know that the Americans have a chance to win this war. Because look, when you're gambling on things, you always want to gamble on sure things. Well, that's kind of what the French are thinking here. So, but we'll pick that up again later in the second part of this lecture. What I want you to understand is that the alliance formed with France was formed by the Second Continental Congress, and it is a way in which the Congress was acting as a national government. Two more. When the war was over, it'll be the Second Continental Congress that will negotiate the peace treaty to end the war. Negotiating treaties such as this is something that a national government does, and this is something that the Congress will do. Again, we'll talk about that later, but it is another thing that the Congress did that showed it was acting as a national government. And the last is that during the war, the Second Continental Congress will write our nation's first constitution. Now, if you are questioning this, that you didn't know that we have had two constitutions in our nation's history, that's okay. The first constitution in our nation's history was written by the Second Continental Congress, and they were referred to as the Articles of Confederation. They were written during the war by the Second Continental Congress, and this was our country's first constitution. We are currently on our nation's second constitution, but this was the first, and it was written by the Continental Congress. Well, guys, writing a constitution is something that a national government does, and that is something that the Congress was doing. Okay, so these are all examples of how the Second Continental Congress during this conflict was acting as a national government. Again, just to reiterate, they were writing a constitution, they negotiated the peace treaty to end the war, they formed the alliance with France, they recruited foreign military advisors, and they raised the army and paid the army. All things that a national government does, all things that the Second Continental Congress was doing. Okay, so this, when we get to part two, we're going to talk about the battles and campaigns of the war and ultimately the treaty that ended the war. So this will conclude part one of Unit 6. Once you're done with this and you feel comfortable with it, go ahead and move on to part two, where, like I said, we're going to discuss the major battles and campaigns of the American War of Independence.